Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Matthew chapter 6. And as a reminder, as we're going through what's called the Sermon on the Mount, we have been doing, I would say, a kind of a slow crawl through it because I think there's a lot of things that Jesus is saying here that we need to, I think, it really come to terms with as we as we I think balance out, you put like this, our faith journey, which in a lot of cases is just more religion. So it is, and from our perspective, 2,000 years after this sermon, that Jesus talks, that what he says about religion. Okay, I think this is the essence of religion, even though he is referring to the Judaizers, the Pharisees, in their hypocrisy, in their hypocrisy, um, in Judaism, or the law, following the law. What we are seeing is how the Pharisees so corrupted the law of Moses. Now, the law of Moses itself is difficult, especially if you think you can be justified by God. That's a whole nother, a whole nother lesson. Okay, for example, if you read the book of Galatians, um, that's a perfect way of understanding the contrast between salvation through the law of Moses and salvation through Jesus Christ, through faith in Jesus Christ. What Jesus is dealing with here is the hypocrisy of now branching off from the law of Moses, which Jesus, by the way, is ministering under the law of Moses. But what he is contrasting here is the religious side, the perversion or the corrupt religion. So now, if we fast forward 2,000 years, we do the same thing. How denominations have corrupted Christianity, have corrupted God's righteousness by inventing man-made traditions, man-made customs. And so Jesus is contrasting that. So we're going to get into that now with, let's talk about fasting, right? Which is interesting. Here is verse 16 says, whenever you fast, don't be sad-faced like hypocrites, for they make their faces unattractive, so their fasting is obvious to people. I assure you, they got their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face so that you don't show your fasting to people, but to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Now, many people think that fasting itself, understanding what fasting is itself. So the idea of fasting is just simply abstaining from food. So now when you put it in a religious context or a worship context, so fasting is simply a tool that when you are seeking God, when you want to consecrate yourself to seek God, you abstain from food. Now, of course, a lot of times people would think, well, so do I need to fast? Do I need to consecrate myself in order to receive something from God? Now, in the in the Old Testament, you find that people would fast as a way of humility. So, for example, the city of Nineveh fast when God pronounced judgment on them to show God their repentance. They put sackcloth on and they abstained from eating to seek God for mercy. Okay. However, one of the most interesting things when we say that, what is that what is that we think that we're doing when we fast? Like fasting has no spiritual effect on your life. It does nothing for you. It is simply a tool that when you consecrate yourself from God to God, that's it. It's just a tool. I'm setting apart. I'm setting aside so that I can hear from God, seek God. Once you cease from fasting, that is it. There is no spiritual impact. So a lot of people think that there is. A lot of people think that if I fast, I'm going to input some kind of spiritual growth or something. That's just not true. Now, if we also look at Isaiah chapter 58, God talks about the fast that please him. Let me read that right quick. And if you can, and what the kind of fast that God would be pleased with. Uh, let's take a look here. Um, so, let's take a look at. All right, I'm picking up at verse number 3. He says, "Why have we fasted? But you have not seen. We have denied ourselves, but you have not noticed. Look, you do as you please on the day of your fast, and oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife, strike viciously with your fists. You cannot fast as you do this day, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose," this is God speaking, "be like this: a day for a person to deny himself, to bow his head like a reed, to spread out sackcloths in ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Isn't the fast I choose, isn't the fast I choose to break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, bring the poor and the homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. And at the time when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, here am I." Now, I just want to see here a lot of difference in what people think. And let me say this, especially from a religious mind, okay? From a religious mind, how people think the impact of fasting is. In other words, are you really hearing God, what God says about your religious act, right? Um, so again, he's not saying not to fast. However, and of course, remember, the idea here is, in a sense, bragging about it. In other words, letting everyone know I'm on a spiritual fast. Now, another thing is some people think that, like, if I fast, and you will hear this from time to time, let's go on a 3-day fast. Let's go on a 21-day fast. Sometimes it's also called a Daniel fast. And then, of course, if you really, really are spiritual, there's the 40-day fast. And I've heard people say that I'm going to go on a 40-day fast. And I want to be like Jesus, like Moses, like Elijah, the big three here that went on this fast. And look at the power that came because they fast. But that's not fasting, by the way, guys. As I said, fasting itself, the fact that you abstain from food, that's all you're doing when you fast, does absolutely nothing for you. So in other words, when you abstain from food, the idea is, what are you doing when you abstain from food? So maybe you set a time for prayer. Maybe set a time for just, again, seeking God, right? But if you think the fast itself imparts something to you, it doesn't. And the fast doesn't impact your life, doesn't cause spiritual growth, doesn't impart any kind of spiritual power or anything. As soon as you fast, that's it. Give me an example too. Remember, Moses fasted 40 days, and yet, he ended up, because of his sin, he ended up not going to the promised land. All right, verse 19 says, don't collect for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where the thieves break through and steal. But collect for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, or where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasures is, there will your heart be also. The eye of the lamp, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eye is good, your whole body would be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body would be full of darkness. So if the light within you is darkness, how deep is that darkness? And then he says, no one can be a slave to two masters. Since either he will hate one and love the other, or be devoted to the one, despise the other. You cannot be slaves of God and of money. One of the most simplest verses here, and yet when I think about, and this is why you see the contrast of religion, man's traditions, man's ways. Think about how money is talked about in the church. Just think about that for a moment. Think about how money is talked about. Now, we live in a nation where wealth, success is measured by how much money you have. You even have theologies. I know, because I was saved in the Word of Faith theology. So I could tell you what that theology teaches. I was in one of the churches that the pastor was the architect of the Word of Faith theology. And it took me years to kind of realize that that was a perversion of the scriptures, that God wants you rich. That as a child of God, your inheritance, your spiritual inheritance, is to be wealthy. This is actually what they teach. They teach laws of prosperity. They teach that if you give, if you tithe, if you give to the ministry, you're going to be wealthy. And they teach this as God's promise. Remember the law of tithing, right? That if you tithe, God is going to open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing that there's not room enough to receive. He will rebuke the devourer. That is in Malachi. So why hasn't anyone received that? Why isn't it that the only people who are actually prospering are the teachers that are telling you to give their money? In other words, their prosperity is a direct result of you giving money to them. That is it. So, and yet when we read a verse like this, that don't collect treasures for yourself. Now, keep this in mind. This is said with the backdrop that Jesus tells us the purpose of why we're here. So what is the true, how are you going to have true meaning in your life? By finding then what is God's purpose for your life. So in other words, don't collect for yourself treasures on earth. Now, let's also be clear what Jesus is not saying. He is not talking against being rich. There were people who were wealthy around him. In the early church, there were wealthy people. In fact, some of the most godly people who followed Paul and Peter and them were wealthy. Mary, whose son is Mark, was a wealthy woman who opened her house. Right? In fact, Mary's house was kind of the it house. Like everybody came through Mary's house. The apostles, Paul, everybody. Aquila and Priscilla, Paul's companions, they were wealthy people. they had a church in their house. And oftentimes in the early church, churches, believers gathered in wealthy people's houses. Oftentimes they would, of course, support the ministry. So God wasn't saying that give away all of your wealth, or don't try to even be wealthy. Don't be good business people, right? That's not what he is saying. He does, and the Bible does speak against the greed of wealthy people. And that's why he says here that you cannot be a slave of two masters. So it is, on the one hand, you could say it is perfectly God's will. You could say it is that people prosper. And again, depending on, right? You can say depending on, in America, not everybody's going to be wealthy. And certainly in the world, not everyone's going to be wealthy. Now, the thing about America, of course, is there's the potential, there's the possibility that everyone could be wealthy in America because of our economy. But when you think about the gospel, which is, again, a global message, not everyone can be wealthy because of the economy, because of the government. So you can't just limit, let's say prosperity to just America and say it is God's will for everyone to prosper, because we don't even do that in America. There's not one single church in America where every member, because of the teaching of faith, because of the teaching of prosperity, that people prosper. There are people in the congregation who have opened businesses, have applied market principles, being smart business people. They have prospered. And again, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But what Jesus is saying here is, if that's your treasures, then what he says, moth and corruption. And not only that, but too, just think about this. How many times in terms of cycle does America get hit with a bad economy, right? We go through, a downward slide. Now we haven't had a depression in a while, but every now and then we get hit. And what's always interesting is when we do get hit, that those very same prosperity churches, they lay off people, right? So the point is that Jesus says here is your focus. And I'm going to say this, whether you are wealthy or not, your focus should always be that my treasures are in heaven, that I am seeking treasures in heaven. Now, what are those treasures? Okay, what are those treasures that you're seeking in heaven? God, let me just sum it up quickly. To do God's will, to be fruitful. That's what you're storing up. That the will of God, that when you can say at the end of your life, let me show you this right quick before I run out of time. And this is I think one of the greatest testament. 2 Timothy, and I'm going to say chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Where is it at? All right. I'll start reading at verse 5. It says, "But as for you, be serious about everything, endure hardships, do the work of an evangelist, fulfill your ministry. For I am already being poured out of the drink offering, and the time of my departure is close. It's close. I'm sorry. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I've kept the faith. There is reserved for me in the future a crown of righteousness with the Lord, the righteous judge will give me on that day, and not only to me, but all those who have loved his appearing. Now, think about that statement right there. He said, I've kept the faith. How do I store up treasures in heaven? By finishing the race that God has assigned you. And then he says, I've kept the faith. And notice what he says right here. There is now stored up. There is reserved for me in heaven. So this is what Jesus here, don't collect for yourselves. He said, don't collect for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, but where thieves break through and steal. So in other words, he's not necessarily focusing on the fact of whether or not you have money or not, but where your treasures are. He said, but collect for yourself treasures in heaven, where neither moth or rust destroy, though where thieves break through and steal. For where your treasures is, there will your heart be. So now, keeping the faith, finishing the race that God has assigned you, that is the treasure for you. And by the way, one of the interesting things about what Paul is saying here, okay, I'm gonna go just a little. I'm gonna go back to this and show you something here. When he says right here, so you notice he says, "I have fought the fight." So notice this. This is what I am taking into heaven. This is what I am taking into heaven. In other words, and let me say this, because I have, when I had ministered to different people, one of the most interesting things, because I've been in people who had means, there are people that had wealth and means, and one of the interesting things about them, I remember a dear sister who lived in one of the most, I want to say, neighborhoods that, it's a picture perfect neighborhood, the kind that you see on TV, well-to-do neighborhood. The picture on a Saturday morning, people walking their golden labs. I mean, it's just that kind of picture perfect neighborhood. And she lived there, and I think, wow, look at this, man. Look at the people that live here, right? And I remember as she was dying of cancer, think about this. What good did that house and the picture perfect surroundings, what did it profit her? What did it profit her? Now, as she was dying of cancer, nothing. She didn't even sleep in her bedroom. Like a lot of times with cancer people who are on hospice and stuff, sometimes they have to put makeshift beds in living rooms, something like that. So it can be close, as opposed to say being upstairs. Couldn't even really benefit from that, you know. But you know what she took with her? She had one of the most excellent testimonies. When she was in the hospital, and I would visit her in the hospital, I would watch in awe as nurses, would come on their breaks just to say hi to her, or stop in after work. That her life had touched people that way. And I think about this. You think about all of the people, wealthy people, that when they're dying of, say, the disease, what good did all of that wealth, that accumulation, what good did it do them? She was able to she left that nice picture perfect home and neighborhood. She left that behind. But what she took into eternity was her faithfulness to God, completing the fight, completing the race, keeping the faith. See, that's what she was able to take into eternity. Now, I'll say this. She enjoyed the home when she was here, but that's not what was the treasure that she stored up. All right, guys, don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to the Bible Plain and Simple. And if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.